Hi, John. Hi, everyone.
Hello, Hannes.
Hey, Hannes. We actually had a few people early today, but as has become, I think, not only customary but expected, we'll give a couple of minutes. I know Steve's got a bunch of material to present today on the feeds topic, and he's not here yet, so we'll definitely need to wait for him.
Should I take once again?
If you can, yes. I'll like always, I'll hang on the notepad as well and try and fill in. But if you can do the notes, that'd be great.
Okay.
So yeah, standing agenda from the meeting invite. We really want to nail down this feed structure idea before 118. And we have some movement there, so that's good. I see Steve's on. That's great.
Hey, folks. Wait for people to come to live after that.
Okay, it's 3 after, and it looks like a good bunch of people are on now. Henk's going to be late, so just speaking on his behalf briefly, we're going with the standing agenda today of trying to sort out our primary item, which is feeds. Henk knows some of the folks at Omnivore, so we will continue looking into whether we can get that guest speaker in, but I think we'll assume for now that we won't do that. We'll need to give a couple weeks notice anyway. So yeah, let's try and keep on topic and get this feed ID thing worked out ahead of 118. So I know there's been quite a lot of work in the background with Steve, some folks from the archivist team, and I think Ori has been helping with that as well. So I don't know if Steve, if you're sort of equipped and ready to just sort of kick off with some ideas or lead a discussion, that would be most useful.
So, sorry, was that my echo? Was that somebody else? Okay, I think that was my echo. I was reading through the thread for the company identifiers thing, and there was a lot of great information, and I put some notes in the Slack channel from IETF. And I think the piece that I was coming away with is there was a lot of this great discussion around the company identifiers as part of the feed ID. And what I was reading through is there's this, I was figuring out, can we separate those two things out so that we can make some progress on those independently? And what I mean by that is if we think about the way SCITT does things, is it does things one thing really well in that it stores statements made by an identifier, and those are separate objects that are linked together. If we can tease out the identity to being the identity that's associated with the feed ID, then we could have these independent conversations. And there's a lot, as we were looking through the various use cases, which we need to continue to document these. If a feed ID is just a generic string of some sort. We should talk about that more. But if you tease out the identity from being embedded into the feed ID, when you create a feed, is it created by an identity? Does that give us the one thing that SCITT does well, ability to reuse? So that was part of what I was, because we were going through this iteration last week. I was talking about embedding versions and a structure. And after reading all of that thread, it was obvious that there's a lot of different opinions around how it could be used. So should we be bringing it back to a more very generic thing and letting those scenarios evolve independently above that? I don't know if that's too abstract in thoughts. Discussion. Hey, Ray.
All right, trying to turn myself on. So I thought about this earlier, and yes, I agree that the identity, the details about the identity are probably going to are very different from the product that we're putting into the feed. So the details, so we don't want to put all the details, just a reference to some other information about the identity. If we wanted to do it at all, as you say, maybe not. But if you don't, then I think there's a problem, and that is that you have. I think that the main thing that SCITT is doing is linking the two. That is, who is making the statement. If you can't link who is making the statement, and you just have statements being made. Now, the statement itself, I guess there's a way to put in who's making the statement inside the statement, but eventually we have to know who's making that statement, so that we can say, do we trust that person or that entity, and be able to do the other thing, which is to find the statements that are linked to the entity. So if you just have links to SCITT entries, which are identifiers of the feeds or the products, then if you want to go the other way and say, okay, here's an entity, company X, what are all of the products that are in the SCITT? If you don't put it in there, then you're going to have some other additional registry that says, okay, they could maintain it themselves, they put it somewhere else, but then do you trust that? So then there's a list of, here's all the things that I put into SCITT. I think you're going to have to put it in. I mean, I'd love to see all the arguments for not doing it, but I think that the joining of the identity, not all the details, but just some kind of a pointer to the identity record, whether that be the X509 thumbprint, or hopefully a DID web URL type thing, that is essential for what it is. That's the statement of what I think kind of supports that argument. Thanks.
Hank is next. Are you referring to, so if you look at SCITT.io or even the IETF Slack thread, because I updated where it says claim to statement, but if you go to SCITT.io, there's a reference at the beginning when we're trying to define what is SCITT, there's an identity that makes a statement, word read statement instead of claim, about an artifact. There's optional pointers to evidence. That's the link to some doc. And again, we can change the words on here because this is a little bit dated. But that's effectively, could a feed be itself a statement, so that the same way that we're creating identities for statements can be the way that identities are created for a feed ID? So I kind of heard you say, maybe I'm just hearing what
I think if you're saying that, gee, it's a great idea to use SCITT for creating identities. And actually, before we get started with submitting products, gee, let's submit the like the semantic name of this person. And, you know, basically, here is the URL to the DID web information for this identity, and then that's submitted as a signed statement. That sounds fine to me.
Hey guys,
and
this is sorry to interrupt.
is that what we're
Is
talking
there a
about?
particular? I'm sorry. Is there a particular change request or SCITT GitHub entry that we're talking about here? I'm looking at the.
So Charlie, we're still talking about the one and only primary target for both Scrappy and the architecture document, which is to determine feed structure. This was the action item that came out of 117.
Okay.
So there are a handful of small edits coming in, but as you might have experienced in a couple of prior meetings, we're trying to work out even the requirements that everybody wants. So all the discussion about how we search things or whether we should search things also ultimately comes down to the distillation that Steve's come to, which is, you know, the feed ID may or may not be comprised of the things you're searching for. And I think the discussion we're having now is essentially arguing the case for you can find it, but it is not composed of those things. So that's the topic. And I expect, apart from a few tactical things with PRs and whatnot that are going through for clarity and so on, this is the big one we have to sort out.
Okay. I guess it would be helpful to have a reference on those things. We are jumping around quite a bit. I wasn't there, obviously, but this is, this is a significant issue, obviously.
Yeah. So I'm hoping if we can get some, let's carry on the discussion. But I'm hoping that if what Steve has scratched up on the SCITT IETF group on Slack, and the discussion here holds water, I think we'd be able to prototype it into Scrappy and let people see what it looks like. So hopefully it'll be a bit more concrete for you in a week or so.
Well, I don't have Slack, so I mean, is that now the official means of communicating? We have email, Slack, we've got GitHub, and we've got this call. I mean, I just having trouble following all the threads. I mean, I'm involved in, probably 12 different projects similar to this, and it's really hard to keep all the threads straight. So I'll withdraw right now, but I think we need to get that down because I can't follow it, honestly.
Yeah, no. So the only place where we make summaries and actually do a sort of prioritization of issues and so on is at these official interims, and the only place where full polls and decisions, notification of meetings, modification of minutes or agendas happens is on the mailing list. So you don't miss anything quote unquote important from the low bandwidth point of view, but there are a number of high bandwidth channels that people use to make sort of quick progress. But it's all discussion. Nothing gets decided or put in stone until it comes here.
Okay, well, thanks for the explanation. I guess I would prefer to use the email channel to the greatest degree possible, since that's the one that I'm on all day long, every day. No, it's fair. And I just put it in the message that that is the official channel. I will go send the content I put there to the email thread. Yeah.
So this is Hank. Hi, everybody. I want to come back to the feed topic, where I had some in between times that I have no time, and there are some extensive feedback sessions with authors and editors of IDs, and feeds do not exist in a vacuum. There are three header parameters for issued statements, signed statements, sorry. Defined. One of them is the issuer, of course. So a feed is always a subordinate to the issuer. and there is a subordinate to the feed, which is the registration info bundle, I want to say right now. And so in this registration info bundle, it might be a useful point to keep the general specification actually there, and then create from that point of that bundle, so that registration info container, a kind of, I want to say, profile, although it's literally not a subset, it's only augments. And then for the software supply chain use case, for example, add items that seem relevant for the issuer to put into the hierarchy below the feed into that registration info bundle. And at the moment, there are only 3 candidates described in the architecture documents. One of them is a sequence number. And it already was hard for me to argue that that is an optional item, because maybe I always want to keep track or put the burden of keeping track, actually, because you're issuing it, which sequence number now happens in this feed, so that you have a counter. Maybe it's too much burden to prescribe an issuer to prescribe it to keep that counter, so you just move on without it, and you have to need an index service to create that on top of the append-only log. I don't know yet, but what I think is a viable way might be to test, at least, is to figure out which defining characteristics we need below a feed identifier, maybe a sequence number, maybe a version, maybe other things, and that an issuer can put into this registration info bundle, and then move from there. I think that seemed to be not super critical or contentious with authors and editors. So I want to raise that idea here verbally first now, and then maybe write it down and restate it on the list.
In the queue, so it looks like
I'm not hearing any dissent.
No, sorry, I was trying to.
Is there, in fact, a description of this somewhere?
Unfortunately not. So I think it's in the architecture. I also think it's not expressed well. So the editors are fixing that. So tomorrow there will be an editors meeting, and I think then we can assess what the phrasing looks like tomorrow, and from there I can take on the task to write that up and push it to the email list as a proposal. And then we have to find out what might be needed. Maybe there's nothing else in a sequence number, you know. I don't know. And maybe we have to go through certain example sets. And I highlighted it before. It might be useful to create a reference example set of statements about software supply chain in order to then come up with some of these items that an issuer wants to put into this registration for a bundle. But again, that's very preliminary, and I would not know what is there and how it would be phrased. So writing the concept up first and put it out, and then work on potentially identifying those is next.
Solid. Thanks, Hank.
Yeah, good. And so that can turn into a PR for discussion and potentially approval next week, which would be great. Yeah, I mean, I had my hand up, so I'll take my place in the queue just to sort of respond to Ray's and Steve's discussion. The reason that this became such a big topic in 117 and why I think we need to get it fixed for 118 comes from the sort of the constant discussion about whether or not SCITT is useful for a whole application. And of course, you know, it's not supposed to be an application and it's not supposed to be an instance of a service, but you do have to be able to build services off it. And that raises the questions of searching and so on and so on. The architecture does already say what a feed ID is, or a feed is rather, and a feed is just a collection of statements about an artifact. Unfortunately, it doesn't explain what an artifact might be. And that's where you get into this ambiguation. So just to reinforce one of the things that I said a moment ago in a slightly different context, the thing that I think we need to get to is, how do we enable this kind of abstract thing, this identity that goes in the protected header and is a constant somewhere? How do we enable the discovery of that based on real world sort of properties or constants that implies some kind of search or listing at the very least? And when this was discussed in the immediate aftermath of 117, it was kind of controversial whether or not SCITT should be searchable. And so we need to come up with a set of structures that support that. And I think what Henk's just said, and what's certainly in my mind, is that if you make it listable, but the necessary set of parameters is an empty dictionary, I think that's good enough. And I think that's the place that we're coming to here, is that we can support the software supply chain in that way without imposing any unnecessary sort of scope creep or application semantics in SCITT. So yeah, apologies to folks like Charlie and many of us who work on 100 things at once. It seems like it's jumping around, but these are all terribly related questions because they all kind of refer to each other, and that's the solution we're trying to get to. And I think we're getting to one that's very elegant, unless people really disagree with that.
So yeah, I'm next on the queue. So few things I kind of agree with what Hank mentioned is we need to provide an example of how feed can be utilized and how it can look like in some way in the document. Otherwise, just making a statement that it's some identity regarding the artifact is something. And another point I wanted to mention is about the Steve statement is, why should the issuer identity be part of the feed? I'm failing to understand. It is the issuer trying to identify any assertions or any metadata associated with an artifact with some kind of an identifier which is logically increasing, and any data associated to an artifact being pushed into the SCITT registry be identifiable. So that linkage to the issuer identity is something I'm not very clear about. That's what I wanted to say that, yeah. Nate.
So if I'm at the top of the queue, yeah, I mean, I'll pile on to the, hey, can we please have a reference to whatever it is that people seem to be talking about? Steve seems to have posted something in Slack. He said he's gonna post it to email. Can you post it to the chat right now? It had something that I guess others are now also wondering about the feed having some indication in the name of the feed about who is posting statements. And I guess my concept that I see reflected in the questions in the note taking is, surely a feed is going to have the ability to have statements from multiple issuers about, you know, an artifact, a product, whatever. You know, if only one person can comment in a feed, then it seems to have lost utility for people who are just interested in the artifact. So, but starting off again, is there a link to whatever the thing that Steve is talking about that we can review? Thanks.
Yeah, Neil, sorry. My comment was I read the thread from, and it was leading up to 117 on the whole company ID identifier conversation. So I pasted it in the chat here, but I will reply to the email thread with it, and we'll use that for, because I totally appreciate that there's a few people, there's several people that are not on the Slack, and that's totally fine. The mailing list is the appropriate place, so I'll respond there. I pasted it here for if that helps. But The other very
Thank you
important
so
piece I
much.
think to come from this is to have the document that we can review prior to the meeting. So whether that's an issue, a PR, or another document that we could all read and get the same context would be super helpful.
Amen. Thanks.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Excuse me. I have just one other thing I wanted to talk about briefly on this topic, and that is the larger issue of searchability and indexing and query capabilities of many kinds is sort of orthogonal to a log. I mean, you can search the log, but pretty much you're grepping at that point, right? Especially if we're talking about sort of a blockchain structure, it becomes, I think, quite heavyweight. So we should really consider that carefully, what we want to do there. And maybe there's maybe there's an informational database that goes along with SCITT that can be done. It can be used for those utilities, but I think SCITT as it stands right now is going to be, it's going to groan under the weight of query loads and implementation. Just my opinion. Thanks.
Yeah, I raised my hand. So I think one of the main issues that where this feed topic came into the picture, as John mentioned, was really related to the need to search through that database, and I think that's because there's one entity or several issuers putting something into the SCITT registry, and then there are other entities trying to get some information out of it. If there's no searchable function, or as Charlie put it, there's a separate database to search for something, I think then the issue or challenge is kind of mitigated to a certain extent. But and I think the history of why that topic surfaced was a little bit triggered by the debate about the key trends, because they had specifically added an extra feature to make their database searchable. They have I forgot what type of tree they added, and so specifically to search. And maybe that's not a requirement for what we do in SCITT, and we indeed have to rely on a separate database that maintains the more detailed information, and then searching becomes less of a challenge. But still having a way to identify, maybe in a profile, on what the artifacts are, to make it easier for someone to correlate. That was something that was discussed in context of this company ID email discussions, because the topic of identifying the company surfaces often in the attempt to identify software. So, and if the artifacts that we talk about, the software supply chain, refer to obviously software packages and software in general, then that sort of lines up there. I hope that makes sense.
Perhaps to kind of respond to what Hannes said, maybe we need to kind of describe in few words what exactly is the need for this feed as well. That's just a off-topic comment, off comment coming from Hannes's statement. Yes, Dick, you're next.
Thank you, Yogesh. So I just want to comment about the company ID information and product identification. There was a lot of discussion that went down in the NTIA when we were developing the SBOM spec standards, I should say, the framework, about this very concept. And a couple of things I think we settled on understanding, or believing, if you will, is that, number one, a company that creates software is the sole owner or decider, if you will, of what to name those products. And they also are the sole entity that can decide what versioning information goes with those. So those two portions or pieces of naming are pretty much already determined by the parties that create software. So one area that was definitely needed a unique identifier is the company identifier. Because it's those individual companies that will be naming the software and products, they have control over the namespace for those products. But we need to have a unique identifier associated with companies. And one concept that was kicked around was the use of IANA registered types. For example, DNS as one way to register a company using its DNS registration. And the other was to potentially use things like mail to as a way to identify specific individuals who could also be supplying products. So that's just one of the findings I think that's worth keeping in mind here is that company identifiers need to be unique, but companies make the decisions to name products and assign version numbers. Thanks.
Steve?
If I can get the toggle working there. Yeah, thanks, Dick. So it was actually a lot of your feedback and others that in the thread that I was reading that really helped me resonate this a little more, at least in my head. When I look at the way we've been discussing the conceptual structure, let me just paste the link to it, where you've got, the feed ID, sorry, not the feed ID, an identity makes a statement, read statement instead of claim there, about an artifact. I think that's teasing out exactly what you're looking for. What I saw in that discussion was a little bit of maybe trying to group too much the identity into the feed, as opposed to a feed is created by an identity. So if we can use that same structure, then whatever we decide, whatever that particular instance uses to use as identity is totally fine. In other discussions, and this has been a while back, we've been having these discussions around what exactly is the way identity is represented. Is it X509? Is it GPG? Is it an email? Is it DID? And basically and this is why I'm trying to tease them out as two separate topics, is if we can separate how we're using identity, meaning identities, there's different identity types, and they're associated with a statement through the cozy header, then the envelope, then if we use that same model to define a feed, then we don't need to put the identity into the feed because we've already said we have a way of defining identity. So it basically should, in theory, it should solve the problem of identity is a generic problem we have to solve. Feeds is a way to group a collection of statements about a thing. And if we can tease out those two separate concepts, then I think we start to have a structure that really boils down to a SCITT instance is a way to store identities about statements related of an artifact.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Steve. And I think we also know, I think it's intuitive really, is that, these identities need to be managed. They need to be unique.
Yep.
So we need to leverage, whatever we can. And in this case, the DNS system is already maintaining this level of uniqueness for identities. And the emails addresses are doing essentially the same thing with the mail tos, and each mail hub will, of course, assign email addresses. So those two could be leveraged if that's what we're looking to accomplish. Thanks.
Thanks. I have a point that the feed is much more than the company identity, because it is about company, maybe company as the top level, then a particular product, and then a product and a particular revision of the product. So you could have statements or associated with a particular product and a particular revision of the product. So, and different organizations may want to kind of give identities for their deliverables or artifacts, so to speak, the way they want to. So we can't be very highly prescriptive about this feed should be how it should be. It can be a very generic abstract concept we can and give some examples of how it could be utilized, but I think for giving a uh, rigid requirement may not be very helpful here in my view. Thanks.
Yeah. So just to comment quickly on that, I agree. I think there's a danger in defining too many different ways of going about this, and if you simply have some random identifier that is definable by the feeder or the sort of the administrator of the feed, that is probably good enough. And if you go beyond that, I think we're starting to get into some serious complexities. But just without reading the the feed stuff, hopefully, which will be along later today or whenever, it's hard to grasp it up. But I have another point that I wanted to make as well, and that is on the mailing list topic from this morning. And over the weekend, we talked about the definition of attestation, and I haven't really been following this too closely, honestly, on this, but the flavor of attestation now in use in regulations in the United States is that it is that letter that says, here's my assertion of some qualities, and it is from me, so therefore it should be trusted. There isn't really any requirement for authentication in there, and so my proposal is that we actually say digitally authenticated attestation when we mean that, rather than just using the shorter term attestation. That would solve the problem, I think, of the confusion that NIST has created for itself. And Hank, you were sort of the principal on that, so I would welcome any comment from you.
Yeah, hi Charlie. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Of course, quick deep dive. There's a lot of baggage here. So NIST is about 25 years too late to hog that term, unfortunately. So we can't ignore what's already out there by trusted computing groups, FIDOs, global platforms, etc., and now including IETF with RATs. I think a concise, qualified term that is not just attestation is good. I am not sure what that is today, but I absolutely agree that they have to be differentiated, and maybe we can have the terminology sit in next IETF meeting or something co-located.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite unfortunate because obviously they're both in heavy use, so it's going to be difficult to disambiguate.
Yeah, I think that number one, I wanted to mention that I think we should drive toward DID web as the main solution for identity. And I'm still reviewing it, but that's certainly what it looks like is going to be the best approach, because there is some movement to change right now and to fix some of the things from X509. That'll be a smart way to go. The feed thing, really wasn't part of the initial discussion, and I know it's a handy little word, but I don't even know if it is something I think that there's still concern in my mind that we all are thinking different things when we say feed, and that it isn't well understood what it is, or even if we need it. So those are my my statements. I think that if we had the product semantically defined, like for software, there's a name, there's a revision, there's something that we go by. At some point, it has to come back to a human being semantic label to things, so that we can match it up. It can't be a hash. Okay, so it has to be something that we can look at and understand what it is. And then for different supply chains, though, those might be very, very different kinds of things. You're not going to have the same, revision identifier kind of thing on, maybe a hardware component or something, a resistor or something, so in a different scope realm, I don't think we can get into that. And so that's why I'm stating that we just say, you put in a semantic name for the product, you put in the issuer, you make a statement, and then up a level, if you will, in the API is where we can deal with saying, okay, look, for software, we're going to have the name of the package, the revision code, and so forth, and say, here's how we're going to have a semantic name for what software is, perhaps. Anyway, okay, thanks.
Dick, you're up next.
Yeah, thank you, guys. I just want to go on the record supporting what Yogesh said earlier about being careful about being too prescriptive. Clearly, we have to be prescriptive when it comes to company ID because A, it needs to be unique, and B, it needs to be verifiable. So you need to be pretty precise in being able to identify a company. But I would avoid any attempt to be too prescriptive with other areas, and that was a lesson that CSAF VEX learned. Is they tried to they made an assumption about versions, and they used version ranges to describe product version ranges, and of course companies don't always follow some ordinal space for their versioning, right? Some of them use hashes, and some of them use things like H2, like Microsoft does. So I would avoid anything that gets down into being too prescriptive with regard to product and versioning. But clearly, we need to be very precise with the company ID because they need to be unique and they need to be verifiable. Thanks.
Yeah, listening to the discussion, I indeed wonder whether we need to make a decision about whether we want to have that searchability feature from a SCITT transparency service point of view, or whether that could be an add-on kind of database that is obviously in a product, but not necessarily as part of SCITT, because the benefit such approach has is that we don't need to go into the details of what the index is to do the lookup. And so, because then you could search essentially for anything you like. In Keytrend's case, because it's a very specific application, they have the advantage that they, from the start, want to store a username to public key binding. So they look up, the search is basically given as the username, but we have a little bit of more, or I think we have a more complicated scenario. And so if we kind of acknowledge that this is application specific, as Ray was saying, like different supply chains may have different sort of ways to identify the artifacts and whatever they have in there, then we can sort of like point this out and basically toss it to the application or to a profile of that application.
I'm 100% with Hannes on. Yeah.
So I'm next in the queue, so I'll just jump in. So I totally agree. This has been one of the conversations we've also been thinking about is, where is the SCITT layer and where is the application specific layer? Because we see SCITT being used in multiple scenarios. We're focused on software supply chain as the initial scope, but where else can it be used? And if I look at things that I personally, I keep on using email as an example. There's a set of email protocols that are out there, and it's enabled a very vibrant ecosystem for people to communicate. And then there's applications on top of it that do interesting things with the email protocol, including search. So that makes a lot of sense. On the purpose of a feed ID, if I go back to what Antoine and Cedric were kind of pointing at and what's in the document, in the architecture document, is the ability to group a collection of statements on a thing. So the question we've been discussing, and I found the issue, I put it in the notes there, as clarification of what a feed ID is how do you group a collection of things? And I think that's the piece that we've been trying to balance, is how prescriptive should that structure be? Including version and architecture was one of the things I was discussing last week, and I'm now in the pendulum swing of pivoting back to should a feed ID just be a unique string, an identity creates it, and in that is a set of name value pairs that could have platform architecture version, it could have Gleaf ID, if I'm pronouncing it right, and all the other types of IDs that I saw discussed in that thread. And if that is, a collection of properties stored on the feed ID, which if we just make that a special type of statement, then we have the root information for somebody to create search APIs on top of it. And we've, back to Dick's point around the identity, totally agree that we should be prescriptive around identity. There are a bunch of groups, and this is what, one of the things Ori keeps on pointing out, is there's a bunch of very smart people working on various identity work. And should we lean into that work and just say that a cozy envelope has an identity, and that identity can be various types of identities? When someone is submitting a statement to a SCITT instance, the registration policy can choose to say, I don't accept certain identity types, because the type of information is, requires more. So I think those primitives can address what I think the root thing we're trying to address here is, how does a SCITT instance represent a set of a collection of statements on a thing, and can evolve over time, the time being the timestamp of the counter signature putting on the envelope. And then because that information is structured and there's different content types, application layers can choose how much they index into that and make sense of for the scenario they're trying to solve. Neil.
Hi, thanks. This is slowly coalescing. I appreciate it. I just wanted to quickly talk about the notion of identities and quote unquote companies. I don't think, so Dick talked about identities being unique. That's a good idea, but verifiable, I think verifiable and the notion that they're only companies is too restrictive. And so what they need is some sort of, I'll call it cryptographic coherence or something. I mean, there needs to be a way for an identity to establish a reputation and continue, proving that it's who it started off being, and others can comment on it and refer to it. So I just don't want us to lock us into companies are the only things that can make statements, and you have to find them in Dud and Bryant Street or whatever. And certainly, I love Steve's comment that sure, a registration policy could say we're only going to deal with people that we can find in, some other external database. And then I just wanted to come back to this notion, which is raised in the chat or in the notes. I'm not sure if we've pinned it down. It seems very critical to me I think multiple entities, actors, issuers or whatever need to be able to show up in a certain feed. So the feed isn't uniquely identified by the identity of the statement, the issuers of the statements posted on the feed. So does anybody disagree and think that a feed has to only come from a single source? Because if it can, then how do we coordinate different feeds that all reference the same artifact? Thanks.
Yeah, it can't be restricted to one source, because the idea here is that suppliers of all types are going to be registering their info in SCITT, or at least that's one use case, and they are not going to be the same entity, obviously.
Yeah, so just to jump in, I wrote that note, and I wrote it specifically to agree with you two. There are implications of some of the technical chat that's been happening that would stick it to one person, and I think that's a bad thing to restrict to. So I think we're all, if only one thing comes out of this meeting, we're agreed on that one. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to respond to Steve because he raised a couple of good questions. I think in the meanwhile, after this discussion, I think the feed should be more or less just should be a string, should be unique. So an application or profile should define whatever it wants to stick in there. I also think that the other idea that Steve, you raised is, like, if you want to have more information, you can stick it into the claims and as a kind of a name value pairs, and we have that capability to enhance sort of the structure. So that makes also sense to me. And also your statement about the identity, and Ray mentioned, I think it was Ray mentioned earlier, that starting out with for the issue identity with the DIT web is like a good idea. So that's what I would do.
Dick?
Thank you, Yogesh. Yeah, I want to clarify something that Neil said, because I disagree with him. When we were talking about the NTIA work and identification, we didn't limit it to just companies because there's a ton of open source software that's been written by individuals. And so they need to have unique identifiers as well. And so the concept behind identification was not strictly limited to being companies, but being companies or email addresses that could be used to represent unique individuals. And those are verifiable, as you know. That you could send an email to an address, and if it's not valid, it gets bounced. So they are verifiable in that sense. So just want to clear up. The concept is to support companies as well as individuals. Thank you.
Hi, I know this is slightly off topic, but we are coming close to the hour. So I think we last Monday we had agreed to kind of resolve the pull requests open, but I just checked. There's still the pull request open from Hannes. So are we going to progress this and discuss this during this remainder of the meeting, or what is the state? Hannes, maybe you can shed some light a little later. Thank you.
Take that one. Hannes, do you want to take that? I don't know if my mic got.
Yeah, in the risk of jumping the queue, Steve. Yeah, one of the issues was that there was this other PR that was accepted, and so it created some merge conflicts which need to be resolved first. Because I think Antoine's or Cedric's pull request made changes throughout the whole document, so that's something to be done.
Thank you, Hannes, for the clarification.
Yeah, we've been culling down through those, as the week progresses, and in the, the editors meeting, we've been focused very specifically on getting through those. So just a quick reiteration, because I think it's really important that Neil mentioned, and Dick was mentioning also, is that when we say company, we should be careful. A company is just a type of identity. There will be lots of identities. And they'll go from individual humans to projects, which are a collection of humans, to companies, which were obviously collections of humans, but the humans become more abstract because we don't, knowing the human at a large company can actually itself be a security issue. Because if I know that, you know, Ralph, I'm just picking a name, works there, that I can go after and target his family, and then things are assigned by him, or, you know, then questionable. So I think we need to figure out how to, an identity of an entity is not meant to be limiting to any particular type. When we think about the registration policies, I've heard us talk about the ability that a registration policy can choose who it accepts, and and I'm sorry, I've lost track of who brought this up. I can't remember if it was Charlie or Neil, that a SCITT instance can choose to accept input from lots of entities. So a particular company might say, I don't accept, you can host their information around a particular product on your SCITT instance. And that's totally valuable. If you think of security companies, they make information available where they rate a quality of another company, right? That's what all security scanners do. That's a valid scenario. If a company, you know, let's just, Microsoft run its drivers, for instance, and unfortunately Roy was traveling today, so I should bring it up when he's here, but they let others put information around Microsoft drivers on the Microsoft feeds. So those are valid scenarios, but I think it's really just up to whoever is hosting that feed to decide who, I said feed, sorry, feed in the generic sense, not the feed ID we're talking about here, that there is a service that elicits information, provides information, and it's up to that service host to decide who can put information on it. The thing that makes why feed ID is important is if the scenarios I've been using with Rabbit Networks being the producer and Acme Rockets being a consumer. The last one I started playing with is Cosmic Security, is a security company that makes statements. The way Cosmic Security can make comments of statements of quality around the net monitor software from the Rabbit Networks company is the feed ID. That's the correlation between those. So that's why I think feed ID is important, not just because I can make a stream of updates on a particular SCITT instance, but another SCITT instance can make statements of quality on an artifact that somebody else produces. So, but I totally also recognize we need to write that down with more, and this is where I think the SCITT.io site can help with some concrete examples. Cover what you were concerned about, Neil and Dick, because I think you were about specifically around the types of identities.
That's helpful. Thanks. I put something in the chat too for Dick.
Thanks.
What, I know we're getting close to the end, but I just you just brought something up that I thought was maybe a good idea, and that is it might be useful to use the same architecture that they use with the DID web, where they have another document that defines the feed, if you will, and then that would be included in the SCITT instance as another reference. So inside this, by instance, I mean statement or submission. So then the header would be the, I guess, key ID, which would go to the DID web document, and then the feed would potentially go to another document like that that would identify the feed. So when you submit it, you wouldn't have, you would submit what it is. It's the same thing. It's saying this is the product, but I'm just saying to relieve the pressure on this, it might be okay to have it be a reference to another document versus just the information right there. Okay, thanks, and good meeting.
Yeah, I got to drop. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks. We'll get these things written down more formally for next week. I think there'll be something to review. I think we've got some good agreement here. So thanks.
Yeah, I think that'll help having a written submissions. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks. Take care, guys.
you all.